Welcome back to the Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy, and I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. It's a bit of a mouthful, so most folks call me Bob, or Bob the Wizard. Although this week I have been renamed DumbleBob the Wise by a young dungeon master. I rather like it. It sort of sticks. On recounting my new name to my children, they turned around and said, "Well, what's wrong with Professor DumbleBob at Bob Bolt's School of Special Wizards and Wizardry?" And by special, they mean multi-dimensional window lickers. Bless their cotton socks. So, introductions aside, for tonight's little wandering, I was struggling for a title. And so what came to mind was Professor Dumbledore and the Chamber of Compensation. Well, it sounded better than, I don't know, In Court and Closure, which is effectively what it was all about. Closure. One of those things in life that's often tricky to gain, but so essentially needed in order for us to move forward. In many ways, this great epic telling of my tale has been my closure of me putting the last decade to bed. Its lessons learned, ready to move on. In this world, of course. About 3 and a bit years that I didn't work over the course of my accident. A year or so flowed after that. So we're back relatively 6 years ago, 7 years ago maybe. And it was time to put my accident to bed, physically. I was as recovered as I was going to be. I'd been through umpteen medical tests. I'd had medical opinions of both from my side and from the driver's side. As you do in these cases, I'd been all over the place, Harley Street there, legs measured, orthotics assessments, you name it. And a body of evidence had been presented for a compensation claim. Now figures started to get bandied about, more requests for more paperwork, which I'm happy to do. It's going to be my future at the end of the day. While all of this was going on, I was busy getting back on with my life, getting back in the saddle again. I'd got back on a bike. I'd proved to myself, proved to everyone I suppose, but ultimately to myself, that I could overcome my fear, overcome the anxiety, just get back on the bike. And while I didn't have that same carefree love of riding that I did pre-accident, it's always sitting there. The body remembers. The body keeps the score. I was enjoying my riding. I was able to achieve a state where I was not tied up with accidents. I was proud of myself. I was pleased with myself. I'd gone on back into physical work again. Okay, it had taken me a while. I was nowhere near as fit or as strong as I was pre-accident. I still carry the leg injury, but though it has taught me to slow down, no bad thing. It's taught me to plan, no bad thing, and it's taught me to be patient, no bad thing. Clearly, post-accident, I'm not the man I was before. It certainly changed me physically. I have a lot more scars. It certainly changed me mentally. I have a lot more scars. It certainly changed me spiritually. I've had some quite bizarre experiences. But I'd come to a point of closure, really had focus very much on my physical recovery. My emotions were pretty good. Alright, I had down days, I'd had challenges, I'd had off days, but for the most part, that buoyant, vibrant wizard that you see before you was present. Spiritually, I was definitely making sense of the out of body, making sense of the connection, making sense of that expanded awareness that I've been in. Well, you didn't really want to mention that in court. That was not likely to get me anywhere. So while all of these streams were running, the physical was coming to the end, and I was going to settle. I was going to get my closure, my point at which I could move on in life. As I've mentioned in the preamble, a body of evidence was gathered. I knew. I've been around market trading, I've traded for crystals, I've traded throughout lives. I know the deal. You walk around the thing, the horse, look in its mouth, check for plaster teeth, make an absurdly low offer or an absurdly high offer, and there is a degree of horse trading while roughly a middle ground is agreed. Most parties generally want 60-40, most would settle for 50-50. You know how it works. I was expecting this. I arrived in Chambers, I met my team. I met my barrister, very eminent gentleman who'd made some epic defences in his time. I felt assured. At the end of the day, I just watched a personality on television who'd been awarded several million for hurt feelings. Now, I know that hurt feelings have a massive effect on anybody's mental well-being now, but at the time, yeah, I have to say that I was a more physical being, or certainly more physically focused. And in my mind, being hit by a car was a little bit more tricky to deal with than somebody taking a name in vain. Just how I saw it at the time. Well, clearly their loss of earnings and my loss of earnings were going to be slightly different, hence the different figures. But either way, although I wasn't aiming quite that high, I had high hopes for a high settlement. Been a lot of injury, been through a lot myself. My family have been through a huge amount. My ongoing life would be affected by my injury. I felt I had a rock solid case. Well, clearly the two offers go down on the table and instantly both barristers are back in the rooms, as you'd expect. No. And so starts the horse trading. Unfortunately, at the very first instance, my epic level recovery, the fact that I was doing what I loved, the fact that I was back in the saddle on the bike again, all of these factors that had been huge achievements to myself actually counted against me. I was doing pretty much what I wanted to do. I was back in the job that I wanted to do, albeit in a lesser capacity. All future loss of earnings were quite simply wiped off in a single stroke, and with the apology of my barrister, who said, "I'm sorry, Bob, I haven't really read through your case history. You know, these are busy cases, they have a large caseload." He'd taken on board the information he needed to fight what relatively standard open and shut case. It's rare that he's defending a case where the defendant admitted liability on the road because he was a reasonable human being. Simple as that. A man of honour in that moment, and basically it's open and shut case. He hadn't taken on board the fact that, as those of you who've watched the story, it may look like a wizard or wizard, but in my day, I worked for the government. I had a licenseship of the Royal Society of Chemistry. The argument was given that I could go back to that job and earn considerably more money than I was earning, so in which case there was no loss of earnings. Clearly I'd be compensated for the time that I was off, and clearly I'd be compensated for the injury. I was somewhat startled to find out that the injuries have a very tabulated set of payments that the industry have agreed. That bothered me at the time. Less so these days, it's just the game. I understand that looking down, but at the time, clearly this was a big part of me feeling that I was getting closure. Now, the simple fact of the matter remains is that the argument was given is that the insurance company's role is not there to reward me for an epic recovery. Its job is to compensate me for what I can't do. I'd gone out and proved that I could do most of the things that I could. Okay, I couldn't run, but I wasn't much of a runner beforehand. But with the exception of that, there were few physical limitations. My mental health had been well throughout. Certainly not enough to build any kind of a case on, which will be a story for the future. But I was ready to settle, shall we say. We got into the nitty-gritty, the arguing over every single trip backwards and forwards, as everybody does. The detailing of parking tickets, all of this stuff. Until a final settlement was offered. Now, I was aiming high for a 50-50. I'd have settled for 60-40, I didn't even get that. That said, it was still a considerable sum of money compared to what I had at the time, which was debt. It would clear the debts. It would be enough with investment to change some things around the house, old reminders, which was the plan. And at the end of the day, probably in a similar vein to my MOD settlement, I just wanted it done, dusted and moving on. So somewhat reluctantly, feeling it wasn't really fair, the system wasn't fair. I mean, the system isn't fair, the system is there to look after the system, not to look after the individual. How naive was I? But it was a closure, and that was important. It allowed me to move on. With the cheque in the bank, a short while just to make sure I didn't do anything too stupid with the money, invested it, as any sensible human would, in bricks and mortar in my home. Knocked down a few walls, stuck a bit on the back of the house, built a cabin. Physical changes to a space where I'd literally been recovering through all of what I've just told you. The time in a frame, the in and outs of the hospital, all of that was just embedded in the space. The old kitchen where I'd fallen. I felt that a change for the physical would be a change for me internally, and in many ways it was. That all that happened just before lockdown is probably the reason why I'm still having this conversation with you, because I don't think I would have made it through that in the old space with all of those physical reminders and triggers. So there's a bit of advice. You don't have to go and paint your room every time that you have a meltdown, but it helps. Our space, to a degree, reflects us. So changing that space was something that I found to be most beneficial. Closure allows us to move forward. The fact that even if that closure is not 100% what we want, it is still closure and a point to move forward. Now, much of the next part of my journey, being settled, would be living. Living on with the injuries, just the day-to-day stuff. I feel that I made an epic recovery, as I've said, considering where I was, which was practically dead. To up, walking, working. While the material was a degree of compensation and settlement. The fact that once that space changed, every meal, sat down, a roast dinner with the extended family around, cooking a Christmas meal in the new space. That was more than compensation. The fact that I was still present in their lives, they were present in mine, was more than adequate compensation for the life experiences I went through. If only they thought the same, eh? Well, I'll go on a little bit more in the future about some of the challenges that can roll out in the future after events such as these. A few little wobbles on the way, a few recoveries, rather a large wobble, and its resultant closure, which has been the result of these videos. As I've said before, many occasions, it has been so cathartic for me to sit here and just unload, even if that's going out through the electronic airwaves. I have found it to be a way of putting my life into context, into balance, which, given the turbulent times we live in, it's no bad place to be. Thank you for listening to the witterings of a wise old Gandalbob, or DumbleBob, or Bob the Wizard. Take care, go well, and blessed be.